You're listening to the Everything Jewish 10 Minutes at a Time podcast, where you'll learn about every Jewish topic imaginable in about 10 minutes. And as always, I apologize for all of my Hebrew pronunciation, and for this episode, my Yiddish pronunciation as well. I know I'm going to pronounce Hebrew and Yiddish words wrong, so instead of getting annoyed, I give you permission to laugh at how I say things. Today's topic is Yiddish. Now, if you've ever heard someone say oy vey, schlepp, or chutzpah, congratulations! You've already spoken a little Yiddish. Yiddish is one of those cultural gems that's part language, part identity, and part punchline in sitcoms. It's like the bagel of languages. A little chewy, incredibly versatile, and recognizable even if you only know a few bites of it. Yiddish started as the language of Ashkenazi Jews in Europe about 1,000 years ago, mixing Hebrew, Aramaic, German, Slavic, and some Romance languages, because why stop at 2 or 3? It became the everyday language of millions of Jews for centuries, until the 20th century dramatically reduced its speakers. Let's rewind to the Middle Ages. Around the 9th to 12th centuries, Jews living along the Rhine Valley in Germany needed a way to communicate in daily life. Hebrew and Aramaic were used for Torah study, prayer, and religious texts, but you can't exactly haggle at a marketplace or gossip about your neighbor's kugel recipe in biblical Hebrew. So these communities blended the local German dialects with Hebrew words, plus a pinch of Aramaic for flavor. Over centuries, as Jews migrated eastward into Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Russia, the language picked up Slavic vocabulary and sounds. That's why Yiddish has words like bube, grandmother, and kishke, intestines, but also a delicious dish. It was written using the Hebrew alphabet, giving it a distinctive Jewish identity. By the 19th century, Yiddish had become the lingua franca of Ashkenazi Jews, spoken by millions across Eastern Europe. And it wasn't just for casual chatter. It was the language of newspapers, plays, novels, lullabies, and revolutionary pamphlets. One of the most fascinating aspects of Yiddish is its dual personality. On one hand, it's down-to-earth and full of humor, exaggeration, and irony. On the other, it's deeply poetic and emotional. A Yiddish insult can cut like a knife, but a Yiddish lullaby can melt your heart. The language thrives on imagery. For example, instead of just saying someone is unlucky, Yiddish might say, he bought a ticket on the Titanic. Yiddish is also famous for its onomatopoeic words that just sound like what they mean. Schlepp sounds heavy. Kvetch sounds whiny. Plots sounds like something exploded. Even English speakers who don't know a lick of Yiddish sprinkle these words into conversation because they just feel right. That's why Hollywood screenwriters, from Mel Brooks to the writers of Seinfeld, have leaned on Yiddishisms to add comic flair. The language's rhythm and punch make it perfect for humor and drama alike, which is why it continues to resonate far beyond Jewish audiences. Culturally, Yiddish became much more than a language. It became a universe. Imagine Eastern European Jewish towns, or shtetls, where Yiddish was the sound of daily life. Children learned lullabies in Yiddish. Families read Sholem Aleichem stories around the table. Theater troupes traveled from town to town performing Yiddish plays that ranged from comedies about nosy mothers-in-law to political dramas about revolution. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Yiddish culture had blossomed into what some scholars call a Yiddish Renaissance. Newspapers like the Forwards, the Forward, in New York, had hundreds of thousands of subscribers. Yiddish theater was thriving not just in Warsaw or Vilna, but also in New York's Lower East Side. And Yiddish literature included giants like Isaac Bashevis Singer, who eventually won the Nobel Prize in Literature. It wasn't just a folk language anymore. It was a vehicle for high art, political debate, and religious thought. Yiddish became a cultural glue that bound Jewish communities together across countries and continents. But history wasn't kind to Yiddish. The Holocaust devastated the Yiddish-speaking world. Before World War II, about 11 million people spoke Yiddish. Afterward, millions of speakers were murdered and entire Yiddish-speaking communities were destroyed. To make things more complicated, the newly established state of Israel favored Hebrew as its national language, not Yiddish. Hebrew was seen as modern, strong, and unifying, while Yiddish was often dismissed as old-fashioned or tied to the diaspora. In some cases, Hebrew speakers even mocked Yiddish as the language of the ghetto. Meanwhile, in America, Jewish immigrants who wanted to assimilate encouraged their children to speak English, not Yiddish. Many second-generation kids could understand their parents' Yiddish but responded in English, and soon the language began to fade in mainstream Jewish life. By the mid-20th century, people predicted Yiddish would disappear completely, surviving only in history books, theater archives, and the occasional Borscht Belt comedy routine. And yet, like the stubborn bub who insists you take a third helping of kugel, Yiddish refused to go quietly. In fact, in some communities, it never left. Among Hasidic and Haredi Jews in places like Brooklyn, London, Antwerp, and Jerusalem, Yiddish is still the primary spoken language at home, in schools, and in community life. For these groups, Yiddish isn't nostalgia. It's daily reality. Their kids grow up bilingual, learning both Yiddish and Hebrew, or English, depending on location. But outside of ultra-Orthodox circles, Yiddish has also seen a surprising revival. Universities now offer Yiddish language and literature courses. Cultural festivals celebrate klezmer music and Yiddish theater. Musicians and comedians incorporate Yiddish words into their work. Even Duolingo, the popular language app, recently added a Yiddish course, complete with a little green owl urging you to finish your Yiddish homework. This revival isn't about making Yiddish the world's next global language. It's about preserving a unique cultural treasure. Let's talk about the alphabet, because Yiddish does something pretty clever. It's written using Hebrew letters, but with its own phonetic rules. For example, the letter shin, which in Hebrew can be shesh or s, is almost always shesh in Yiddish. Vowels, which Hebrew usually leaves implied, are written out more clearly in Yiddish, making it a bit easier to read once you learn the system. Yiddish spelling isn't as standardized as English or French, so don't be surprised if you see multiple ways of writing the same word. This reflects the oral nature of the language. People spoke it far more than they wrote it. And yet, when you see Yiddish in Hebrew characters, it immediately ties the language back to Jewish tradition, even though most of the words are closer to German than Hebrew. It's like the Jewish version of remix culture. Take one alphabet, blend in grammar from another, sprinkle on vocabulary from a dozen more, and boom, you've got Yiddish. Now, let's address the elephant in the shtetl. Why does Yiddish feel so funny? Even when you're not trying to be humorous, Yiddish words seem to carry extra personality. Some linguists argue it's the combination of German structure with Slavic expressiveness, all delivered in a sing-song intonation that invites exaggeration. Others say it's cultural. Jews living in precarious conditions developed a sense of humor as a coping mechanism, and Yiddish became the perfect vehicle for irony, sarcasm, and jokes. That's why comedians from the Marx Brothers to Mel Brooks to Sarah Silverman have leaned on Yiddish phrases to land a punchline. But Yiddish isn't only funny, it's deeply soulful too. Yiddish lullabies like Rozhinkes mit Mandlin, Raisins and Almonds, are hauntingly beautiful. Yiddish poetry often wrestles with themes of exile, resilience, and longing. So while Hollywood might love Yiddish for its comedic punch, the language carries an equally rich emotional weight. Today, Yiddish occupies an interesting spot in Jewish identity. For Hasidic Jews, it's a living, breathing mother tongue. For secular Jews, it's often a symbol of heritage, nostalgia, and connection to grandparents who spoke it fluently. For scholars and artists, it's a field of study that reveals the richness of Jewish history and creativity. And for everyone else, it's that quirky source of colorful words that have slipped into English. Think about how many times you've heard kvetch in a sitcom or chutzpah in a news article. Even politicians use these words. That's the beauty of Yiddish. It survives not only as a community language, but also as cultural spice, flavoring the broader world, and it keeps reinventing itself. Young Jews are forming Yiddish punk bands, hosting Yiddish Zoom classes, and even making memes in Yiddish. It's a reminder that languages aren't static. They bend, adapt, and persist, much like the Jewish people themselves. So, where does that leave us? Yiddish may never return to its pre-Holocaust numbers, but it's far from dead. It thrives in Hasidic homes, university classrooms, comedy clubs, and online chat groups. It's a bridge to the past and a tool for shaping Jewish identity today. Whether you hear it in a Brooklyn bakery, a klezmer concert, or a sitcom punchline, Yiddish carries with it 1,000 years of Jewish life, laughter, and resilience. It's the language of both tragedy and comedy, exile and belonging. And even if you only know a few words, maybe mensch or oy vey, you're part of the story. Thanks for listening to this episode of Everything Jewish 10 minutes at a time. If you enjoyed it, please send it to a friend who would appreciate some Yiddish spice in their life, and leave us a review so more people can find the show. Until next time, don't be a kvetch, be a mensch, and keep learning.